All right, my name's still Billy. Part of my job is to spend some time reading to try to prepare for our time together. So this week I spent a little time with this handsome fellow. His name is Stephen Charnock. He was a 17th century Puritan writer, known primarily for this book, Discourses upon the Existence and Attributes of God, in 2 volumes. I made it through most of chapter 1, partly because I was especially struck by this statement. He said, "Men may have atheistical hearts without atheistical heads." In other words, there's a kind of atheism that doesn't deny God's existence. It just lives as if he's not there. It sings, it prays, it serves, it attends church, and yet God never actually factors into the real decisions that a person makes. And when we think about the letter to James, this is a letter that is written to believers. These are people who, without question, believe that God is real. But James says that their conflicts and their judgments and their plans, their hearts, all are telling a different story. So let's take a look. What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. And when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So let me suggest a first point, that is that we live as if God were not real when we fight. James starts this chapter with this question: what causes quarrels and fights among you? Now you can answer that, right? What causes quarrels and fights among you? It's the other person. It's their attitude. It's what they said or what they didn't say. But James does not allow us to blame circumstances. He doesn't allow us to blame misunderstandings. He doesn't allow us to blame the other. Because he claims that the war isn't out there somewhere. It's in here. It's in our hearts, in our desires, our passions, our wants. That's where conflicts come from. This should remind you of what he said in chapter 1, verse 14, where he said, "But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. And then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." We want stuff, and we don't get it. So we fight. Because our desires within us demand to be satisfied. Our way demands to be followed. Our kingdom demands to be the thing that rules. And so James says that our conflicts reveal who we really think is in charge. And we do this not always with fists. Sometimes we fight with silence. Sometimes we fight by withdrawing affection. Sometimes we make carefully timed comments. But the mechanism of all those things is the same. Inside we say, "I deserve this, I need this, I want this, and I will make sure I get it." And then comes this painful line: "You do not have because you do not ask God." When conflict erupts in our lives, prayer is not your reflex, self-protection is. So you rehearse your talking points at 2 a.m. But asking God, drawing near, that feels passive or weak, like it won't accomplish anything. Charnock wrote that all sin is founded in what he called secret atheism. Not that the person denies that God exists, but that every sin assumes that God's authority is negotiable. That is, when something else becomes more important, whether it's respect or comfort or control or recognition, we'll do whatever it takes to protect those things. And in those moments, God becomes secondary or even irrelevant. We may be able to say that we believe in him, but practically our desires are who is really our boss. And so when conflict erupts and prayer doesn't occur, you and I are handling the situation as if God is not involved. And when we do pray, James says, we ask wrongly because we spend it on our passions. He says, you're not seeking God when you pray, you're using God. Stephen Charnock wrote this, I would be a lord to myself, and I would not have a God superior to me. You want God to bless what you've already decided. That's not prayer. That's manipulation. We're living as if God were not really there. But of course, our practical atheism doesn't stop with how we fight. It shows up, James says, in what we love. We live as if God were not real when we love the world's values. Pretty strong words coming up here. You adulterous people, don't you know that friendship with the world makes you an enemy against God? Therefore, anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. This is what we call covenant language, particularly in the Old Testament. You see it. You can hear perhaps the echoes of Hosea and Isaiah, Jeremiah, other prophets, Ezekiel. God, said many of the prophets, is like a faithful husband, but his people keep running to other lovers. You might also remember Jesus saying similar words in the Gospel of John, especially chapter 15. And when James is talking about the world, he's not talking about rocks and trees and oceans and animals. In James, the world is a way of life that is ordered without reference to God. The world is the system where identity and security and worth happen without reference to God. The value system that says you and I are the center, that our happiness is the highest good, that our judgment is above all others, and what people think of me is my worth. Friendship in the ancient world wasn't about having buddies. It meant loyalty, exclusive allegiance to someone else, particularly often a patron. Friendship meant essentially choosing sides. You remember chapter 1? James has already warned us about the divided heart, right? He said you can't be loyal to God's kingdom and the world's kingdom at the same time. It's hypocritical to cheer for your country at the Olympics while at the same time trying to destroy it. It's a divided heart. So why do we do it? Maybe because deep down we're afraid. We're afraid that God isn't enough. We're afraid that God's approval won't satisfy our needs, so we chase the world's. We're afraid that his provision won't cover us, so we scramble for our own security. We're afraid his plan might not include what we think we need or maybe what we want, so we make backup plans. James says that's practical atheism. It's living as if God exists, but his ways and his values are not really enough. I want to jump ahead to verse 11 and 12 for our next point. He says, don't speak evil against each other, dear brothers and sisters. If you criticize and judge each other, then you are criticizing and judging God's law. But your job is to obey the law, not to judge whether it applies to you. God alone, who gave the law, is the judge. He alone has the power to save or to destroy. So what right do you have to judge your neighbor? We live as if God were not real when we judge instead of trusting. Notice the words here about speaking evil against one another, slander, gossip, critical speech. James says when we tear someone down behind their back, when we judge their motives, when we point ourselves as their moral superior, what are we doing? James says we're taking God's role. There's only one judge, only one who has the authority and the ability to assess people's hearts and render a verdict, and it's not us. When James talks about the law here, as he does in most of the places in James, he's referring to what he calls the royal commandment in chapter 2. The royal commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And so when we gossip or slander or judge, practically what we're saying is, God doesn't really mean it when God commands me to love you. Maybe we're thinking, God won't deal with this person properly. God won't handle this situation the way it needs to be handled. So I need to make sure that everyone knows what this person did. I need to make sure that their reputation suffers. I need to control how people see them. We don't trust God to be the judge, so we take his job. We don't believe him when he says, love your neighbor. So we find ways around obeying the command to love our neighbor. How do we do that? Well, we redefine the neighbor. We redefine what love means. We don't trust that God sees or that God knows or that God will set things right in his time and in his way. And so when we gossip or refuse to forgive, when we pronounce judgment on other people's character, we're really saying we don't trust God to judge rightly. We assume that God will not act, so we act. We put ourselves in the position that belongs to God alone. Now, verse 13 to 16. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we're going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while and then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil. So we live as if God were not real when we plan without consulting him. I think the problem here is not planning. The problem is planning that assumes that we have control. It's the total absence of God in that planning. It's acting as if we were in control of everything. We're in control of time. We're in control of the future. We have complete certainty that we know how life is going to go. What's remarkable about that is we all know it's not going to go the way we think. And yet, we still plan that way. Notice that God is not denied here. He's not mocked. He's not blasphemed. He's just ignored. He's irrelevant to the conversation. That's practical atheism. We live as if God is not real. So we fill our calendar, we set our 5-year goals, we act as if the future is guaranteed to us, not because we're hostile to God, but just because we didn't think of him. And this is where verse 14 hits us pretty hard. You are like a morning fog, or a mist, or steam from a kettle, or breath on a cold morning. Here and then gone. The future is not something that is guaranteed to us. We don't know if we'll make it until tomorrow. And so the real problem here is arrogance. There's a pride here. This isn't about adding the tagline, if the Lord wills, to our words, although that might be helpful if you do that for a while. It's about a posture of humility rather than pride. C.S. Lewis wrote about pride this way. He said, "The essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind." Pride is the essence of sin. Doing what I want, where I want, when I want, how I want it, because I want it. You see how this works? We push God out of our desires, then out of our loyalties, away from our authority, and then out of our future. So maybe you think, I know that. I know I should do these things. You know that your conflicts come from desires within you. You know you shouldn't love the world while claiming to love God. You know that you shouldn't judge others. You know that you should acknowledge God in your plans. You know you shouldn't be prideful. Right? We know all this. And then we get to verse 17. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. J. Mochier calls this verse the sting in the tail, the gap between what we know to do and what we actually do. That's forgetting God in practice. That's practically being an atheist. Knowing without doing, he says, has a name. It's not that you forgot. It's not busyness. It's not, I'll get to it later. It's sin. Sin is not just doing wrong things. It's failing to do the right things you know you should do. You knew that you should have prayed before you made that plan. You didn't. You knew you should have released that grudge instead of rehearsing it. You didn't. You knew you should have humbled yourself instead of defending yourself. You didn't. James won't let you and I plead ignorance. You knew. You've known for a long time, perhaps most of your life. The problem isn't that you have a lack of information. The problem is between your theology and your life, between what we say we believe on Sunday morning and how we live on Monday. Remember this earlier quote from Stephen Charnock. All sin is founded in a secret atheism. When we plan without God, we act as if God's will is irrelevant. When we judge others, we act as if God's judgment isn't enough. When we choose the world's approval, we act as if God's love isn't enough. Every expression of practical atheism is me asserting my own autonomy. I will decide. I will secure. I will judge. I will control. Kind of heavy for Sunday morning, isn't it? James 4 doesn't let us get away with very much. Thankfully, that's not the end of the story nor the end of the sermon. So let's go back a bit to a part we skipped in verse 6 to 10. James says, as the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So humble yourself before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and he will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. Let there be tears for what you have done. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honor. Humble yourselves. That's the answer to the tendency toward practical atheism, the kind of life that comes from pride. Listen again to C.S. Lewis, where he says, "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that, of course, he's nobody. Probably all you'll think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. And a biggish step, too. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. The first step is to realize that you are proud, that you are living like we are in control, like we have all the answers. That's the opposite of reality. There is only one God, and you're not him. So practically, James gives us 10 rapid-fire commands. Submit to God. Take yourself off the throne. Resist the devil. Stand against the lie that you have to be in control. But notice that's the one where there's not just a command, there's a promise here. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God. Stop trying to handle things on your own. Cleanse your hands, purify your hearts. Get honest about the double-mindedness and the double-heartedness, trying to serve both God and yourself. Be wretched and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned to mourning. Get honest with yourself and God. Admit your pride, admit your sin. These are all words where you must feel it. Humble yourselves before the Lord. What is all that language? That's repentance language. Repentance is that we acknowledge the reality of the situation and we turn in the opposite direction. We turn away from myself and I turn towards God. Humble yourselves. Humility is the antidote to practical atheism because humility acknowledges that God is real, God is in charge, God is judge, God is near. Humility then is not weakness, it's alignment with reality. So there it is, James chapter 4. James exposes practical atheism in our conflicts, our allegiances, our speech, and our plans. And he confronts us with that verse 17, the gap between knowing and doing is sin. But he doesn't leave us there. He doesn't leave us condemned. I think the center of the chapter is not failure, but rather it comes in verse 6. But God. Whenever you see that phrase, but God, in Scripture, you should be ready to hear the gospel. You should be ready to hear good news. But God gives us more grace. How much grace does God give us? More. More grace than our failures, more grace than our pride, more grace than your prayerlessness, more grace than your worldliness, more grace than your judgments, more grace than your anxious plans, more grace than the gap between what you say and what you do. More grace than your habit of living as if God weren't really God. More grace than you can ask for or imagine. More. So stop living as if God's not present. He is. Stop living as if he's not enough. He is. Stop living as if you're the judge. You're not. Stop living as if you're in control. You're not. You never were. And start living as if God were real. Because the God that we keep neglecting is not neglected us. The God we keep neglecting has not stopped and will not stop giving us grace. So this week, let His grace do in you and for you what you could never do. My prayer this week is that we all might rest in the idea that there is more grace, more and more and more.